Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kibingo honey processed Burundi from Nomad Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Nomad, based out of Barcelona, Spain. And this coffee is our June 2024 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. Nomad's also a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, and as a coffee roaster I've enjoyed more and more as the years have passed. This is also our first Nomad review since they added the handles to their bag designs, and truth be told, when I first saw it I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan, but I found myself utilizing the handles a lot more than I expected, so I guess it's a good thing. But we're here to discuss the coffee, not the bags, so we will see how this one turned out. This right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Nomad's recipe, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So Nomad is notorious for being one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in Europe. They're not quite as light as some of the ultralight coffee roasters out there. And interestingly, I feel like they're one of the very few coffee roasters that still use a Probat as their roasting machine. So I feel like the best comparison is old school Manhattan, which was a light roasting Probat using coffee roaster. This one isn't quite as light as some of the coffees I had from them, but even then it's still very light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it was interesting in the sense that it did offer a slight bit of fruit brightness with a Burundi-like savory base to it, and I was kind of curious to see how that might translate to this coffee given that it was a honey processed coffee, and it was kind of interesting that there wasn't any traces of the honey processing to it, as I was expecting maybe a slight bit of fermentiness, maybe a slight bit of funkiness, but interestingly it was one of those coffees where you couldn't necessarily differentiate that it wasn't a wash processed coffee, as it acted like a wash processed coffee in a number of different ways, and the overall clarity was probably the biggest factor within that. In addition to that, there is a fruit forward profile and a slightly sweet sense, but for the most part it's pretty subtle. It's a nice start all around. As we continue on to day 18, as we opted for the Chemex, and it does continue to offer that Burundi-like base in a savory sense with a slightly floral aspect that was in line with the listed peach blossom. Outside of that, it continues to remain a little bit more soft and subtle, and I was expecting this one to maybe be a little bit more intense given that it was a honey processed coffee, but that wasn't necessarily the early impressions we had as we move on to day 21, opting for the April brewer, and the cup does continue to offer that slightly savory-like base to it, with the rest of the cup remaining pretty clean. The cup isn't particularly well defined yet, with a bit of bright tart fruits in line with the listed cranberries, but outside of that it's been solid for the most part. It's been consistent, it's been clean, but nothing that stood out too much from these first couple of tries. Day 24 through the V60 with Nomad's recipe, and this was the best and most defined the coffee had been to this point, with the honey being the most abundant attribute in the cup. In addition to that, there is more of the slightly tart fruit aspects with plenty of the fruit brightness to match the floral sense to it. So given that this is the first time we had maybe a bit more pronounced of a note to it, that of course being the honey profile, it did give this coffee a little bit more to work with, but even then it was still pretty consistent and still pretty subtle in general. Day 27 through the Chemex with Nomad's recipe, and I felt like this coffee was improving incrementally with every single brew that we had, and that does lend itself towards an interesting question as to whether or not this coffee has even opened up yet, because here on day 39 I'm not even sure, as it's still been pretty consistent. It's just every single time I brew it, it gets a little bit better, but not to the point where it's overly noticeable or has really changed that much in the overall coffee. In addition to that, it does have more of that honey aspect present in the aroma, and it's pretty well defined in the cup itself. Off brew, there is a pretty tart fruit component to it in line with the listed cranberry aspect once again. So notes continue to remain consistent as we move on to day 30 through the V60 with Nomad's recipe. And once again, it's continuing to improve incrementally, once again, day by day, with plenty of all-around consistency. The florality is transitioning from being slightly bitter to a bit more sweet, which definitely helped the cup in general. Better defined and pronounced as far as the berry attributes go, with that slight savory base yet again. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was once again a slight improvement from the previous day, though I don't necessarily think it was the overall adjustments we had made, rather the coffee just improving naturally with time. The intensity is the highest it has been to this point, with the floral blossom being the most prominent, at least as far as the aroma, and in the cup itself, with the lingering tart berry aspect and plenty of that savory tea-like base yet again. Day 36 through the V60 with Nomad's recipe, and this one it was interesting because it was relatively tame, as it does continue to offer a slight bit of that Kenyan-like feel with the tart berry aspects and a savory tea base. The finish is quick, but it does present a lingering caramel aspect, and that's one thing that we haven't discussed too much, as caramel is one of the notes that they have listed on here, and I was fully expecting and hoping that there would be that probat-like characteristic to this coffee, and it was there in traces at times, but not necessarily as abundant or prominent as I might have hoped for within this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a few level 4s. So why don't we actually start with the sweetness level 4, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's overly justified within this coffee. I think it's going to be interesting when we discuss it a little bit more alongside some of the other coffees from Nomad that we are going to be reviewing, one in particular that is kind of interesting. But as far as it is relative to that one, I think it justified that level 4 mark, maybe just barely. There is a little bit of that caramelized aspect to it, and that's where a lot of the sweetness comes from. Outside of that, there is a slight bit of a fruit sweetness and a slight bit of a floral sweetness, but they're not necessarily the most prominent factors within this coffee. I feel like they're definitely much more subtle components that are present enough given that the base is clean enough, but not to the extent that I might have hoped for in terms of the overall sweetness. That does take us into those two notes. We'll start with the florality. Level 4, peach blossom is what they have listed on here. I could also see floral honey. At times on the earlier days it was slightly more bitter, but as I mentioned, it did transition into a little bit more sweetness as time passed. Outside of that, though, I think it's just that kind of, I don't want to say nondescript floral sense, but as mentioned, bitter floral and then slightly more sweet floral, but it was present within this coffee right from the onset. Berry fruit, level 4, and that is the cranberries, so it did have plenty of that tart berry components to it. And once again, I feel like maybe if the brightness was a little bit more pronounced and intense, then you could mistake this one ever so slightly for being a Kenyan coffee, especially given the cleanliness to it. Outside of that, though, I wouldn't necessarily say that it really was that reminiscent of Kenyan coffees outside of the savory base. It did have we'll say, slightly more defined in terms of that cranberry-like attribute as opposed to maybe those currants. But that's being really nitpicky as far as that berry component goes. Even then, it's definitely level 4, being by far the most pronounced fruit characteristic within this coffee. And then I kind of wanted to save this one for last, but we'll go through it since it's our final level 4. The cleanliness, level 4. One of the very first things I did mention about this coffee, and it was an ever-present quality within it, because I am always curious when it comes to anything that isn't a wash-processed coffee, how it'll turn out, how it'll translate into the overall clarity of the coffee. And truth be told, this one really wasn't all too different from a wash-processed coffee. Truth be told, I was hoping for maybe a little bit more intensity, and having the cleanliness be at a level 4, on paper, I think that that's good, but given that I was hoping for this coffee to be much more intense, I was willing to sacrifice maybe a little bit of cleanliness if it meant that the overall intensity of this coffee was a little bit more abundant than it was. This coffee, once again, just continued to remain relatively subtle and tame throughout the entirety of it, and it could be that this coffee just hasn't quite opened up yet, but even as I'm trying it here on this day, I don't necessarily foresee it opening up too much more than it already has. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the finish level 3, and it's pretty rare for a coffee to actually score a level 3 in terms of the finish, which goes to show just how quick and fleeting the finish was. It's interesting because, yeah, it finishes very quickly, and then you have this slightly lingering tart berry aspect to it, but even then it's not necessarily a very long-lasting tart berry aspect, and the caramel is there, but it's slightly fleeting as well, which is why it also scored at that level 3 mark, because it's there. Once again, it's something that's definitely found within this coffee, but much like the rest of it, it's a little bit more fleeting and not necessarily overly abundant throughout this one. Final thing, two things worth discussing, actually quite a few things worth discussing. Acidity, level 3, and that is maybe one of the more surprising aspects, given that right from the start there was an interesting fruit bright quality to this coffee, but the more and more I continued to work through it, the more I found that the brightness was not necessarily a defining factor of this coffee. It's there, it's present, but even then some of the coffees that we're working on from Nomad as well definitely had a much more prominent brightness to them, so that's the main reason it scored a little lower in that regard. Spice level 3, and maybe I've kind of downplayed the overall Burundi like spiced quality to this one because it was definitely present, and I mentioned a lot of the we'll say savory tea like aspects to this one. It was there in a spiced quality, and it was present, prominent, and abundant throughout. As far as a lot of these characteristics being a little bit more subtle in general, that was one of the ones that was maybe a little bit more persistent throughout this coffee. Savoriness, level 3, that's the other part of it. Plenty of that tea-like savoriness to it, and I think that's what they might have been going for with that peach blossom to it. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body at that level 3 mark, as it did have a fair bit of texture to it as well, which helped. I can't quite recall. I'm getting my Nomad coffees mixed up. One of them I feel like they said was a little bit lighter bodied, and I can't remember if it was this one or maybe I have that backwards, but I remember when making this tasting, I said it has enough body to justify that level 3, a little bit more medium bodied, so that's where I opted to place it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like this one was actually very beneficial for me, even though it didn't necessarily turn out how I was expecting, given my previous experiences with Nomad's coffees. And if you watch some of our very early reviews, minus the Rwandan coffee that we had a little bit of issues with, the coffees were coming out a little bit more tame and subtle than I was expecting, especially given a lot of the feedback I'd heard about this coffee roaster. And that's kind of led me towards this belief that some of the coffees I have from them are just really nice gems, and some of the coffees are like this where they're just a little bit too tame and subtle, and I can't really seem to get the best out of them, as that seems to be the case with this one as well, and even some of the other coffees that we are going to be discussing from them. And that's why I feel like it's pretty stark when it comes to Nomad's coffees. There are a lot of coffee roasters I have where I'm like, okay, this coffee has a pretty low floor, like I'm not going to dislike this coffee, but at the same time, it's not going to be something that ever stands out for me. Nomad's a little bit of the opposite. A lot of the times I'm going to have coffees from them that just really stand out and are really impressive, and at the same token, because they've set their expectations so high with those coffees, they're coffees like this that I'm also not necessarily the biggest fan of. And that's the same thing that happened with Manhattan a couple of years ago. There were some coffees that would end up being my favorite coffees of the entire year, but at the same time, there were a lot of coffees, especially wash processed coffees, that I'm like, I wanted a lot more from this coffee, and I just did not necessarily get it. That seems to be the case with this one right here, though it did definitely offer some nice traits, which does take us into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you do enjoy a little bit more of your subtle aspects within it without a lot of the brightness, then this one's a pretty good fit in that sense. It mostly continued to skew on that slightly more savory base, so think of your Burundi coffees that you've had maybe in the past. That's the first starting point, but it is complemented well by an interesting tart berry component to it, with enough sweetness to justify the rest of the experience within this coffee, especially in that caramel brown candy probat-like experience for it as well. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kibingo honey processed Burundi from Nomad Coffee. Thank you for watching.